Pleased to have you with us, and I would like to introduce my panelists. I will start with Agnès Bénassy-Quéré, who is a chief economist at the French Treasury, Mrs. Talia Krisikou, who is chair of the Association for Financial Markets in Europe, Jean-Jacques Morin, who is Deputy CEO and Chief Financial Officer of Accor. And we are expecting, I guess, in a very short period of time, Nicolas Dufourcq, CEO of BPI France, who should be joining us in a minute. Video. In the interest of time, I will. Oh, so this is Nicolas Dufourcq, CEO of BPI France. Nicolas, you're visible. You're on the line. This panel will be dedicated to the type of financing to support companies in their growth and recovery project. Let me give you a brief recap of the trends that we have seen recently. We have seen a strong reversal of trend, actually, in the last 9 months. There had been stock market attrition for a number of years, and during the last 9 months, in fact, we have seen a surge in the number of IPOs. As Chairman Ophel has mentioned, we have seen during the first 3 quarters of 2021, 51 IPOs, 17 on the regulated market and 34 on the Euronext growth, which is a strong reversal, because we had seen in the previous year that the number of IPOs were constantly shrinking, and in fact, we had seen that private equity had been much more dynamic, in particular due to the context of monetary policy that provided from strong opportunity to leverage. This phenomenon is European, and in fact, I think, Talia, you will comment on a report by AFMI that mentions the fact that IPOs have accumulated 53 billion in the first 3 quarters of 2021, which is, if I'm not mistaken, almost 5 times the figure that we have seen in 2020. And Paris took its fair share, I think, in this trend, as in fact, at the end of September, in terms of amounts raised via IPO, France was at the 4th rank in Europe, behind London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. Now, to say a word about the AMF, in this context of strong competition between markets, the AMF has been trying to provide the best environment for issuers, and I'm pleased to mention that these efforts by the AMF have been recognized in the report published by Paris Europlace in June, that has mentioned that AMF had provided for a supportive environment for issuers. We have been trying in particular to provide for a regulatory environment that would be most suited to the needs of issuers. For instance, we have been striving to remove the provisions that we had introduced in French law that went beyond the regulatory requirements set by EU laws, what we call the désurtransposition effort. We have also been trying to work in order to provide the right environment for SPAC to be introduced on the Paris stock market. And in fact, we have succeeded to have 5 new stocks introduced and listed on the Paris Stock Exchange so far in 2021. So let me start maybe by asking Agnès, in light of these trends, what's your assessment of the current environment, and how do you see the future of companies' balance sheets?
Okay, thank you, Jérôme. Hello, everybody. So I can briefly respond from a macro point of view and from a micro point of view. The macro, in a nutshell, is the macro outlook is good. So far, so good, I would say. The GDP is back to pre-crisis level. Employment is above pre-crisis level. In big contrast with the United States, participation in the labor market is up. And what else? Investment is extremely dynamic. So the macro outlook is really good. From a micro point of view, so this is your topic, it's good also. We see that firms' balance sheets are quite strong. Leverage, of course, has increased during the crisis. For French firms, it's about 220 billion aggregate increase in debt, but cash also increased to a little more than 200 billion. So in net terms, the increase is actually only 16 billion, which is much lower than the years before the crisis. So you may say that leverage was increasing too fast before the crisis, but still, so we have this strange pattern, and since 21, net leverage have been declining. So, of course, before the crisis, French firms already had a lot of debt and were in need for equity. And on this side, so I'm not going to repeat what Robert Offel said a minute ago, but the news also are quite good in terms of equity flowing to firms. And there has been also a number of initiatives taken by the government in favor of equity and also equity-like or junior debt.
Thank you, Agnès. Maybe bouncing back on your last remark, can I ask, is there a degree of heterogeneity? Do you see specific patterns in the way firms choose their balancing mix? For instance, is there a specific way fast-growing firms choose to be financed, like unicorns or?
So for unicorns, so in France, if I'm correct, there are about 19. There are 19 unicorns in France. Actually, the tech ecosystem is quite dynamic, and for instance, in September 21, French startups raised 2 billion of venture capital, which is almost as high as the total level in 2016. So it's quite dynamic. It's still true that there are important needs to fund the late stage, which is probably what you are mentioning, and scale-ups. Here, and also for the industry, as you know, the industry was one of the priorities of France 2030, and so here, just let me mention the TB initiative that took place, that started last year. The idea is to coordinate private investments in order to create larger funds to finance tech companies. Probably Nicolas will say more about it. And so far it has mobilized 18 billion euros, which is above expectations. And the ambition has been raised to 30 billion by end of 22. So this is something that is working quite well, although we still need to make progress on this.
Okay, thank you. And to conclude on this, what's your assessment of the recent initiatives made by the government, the Pacte Law, and so do you have a global view of this?
Yes, so the Pacte Law, so it's always difficult to disentangle what is due to low interest rates, what is due to new habits, lockdown, which were described by Robert a minute ago. But our assessment is that the Pacte Law is quite instrumental, actually, to incentivize savings in a more illiquid or more risky products. It's also, so with the creation, for instance, of the new pension plan, which is more flexible and which is so far a success. We will see whether this continues, but so far it's quite a success. I think it's almost 4 million people have subscribed in a short period. And the other extremely important point is private equity. So the ability of life insurance to incorporate private equity funds into it. So this has also been quite instrumental. Of course, in this kind of reform, I think what is really nice, and this is by chance, but it goes well, is to lean with the wind. you know, in macro, we always say that it's better to lean with the wind than against the wind. So there are winds, interest rate, low interest rates, new habits, and you push a little further with the backed law, and it has a multiplying effect. So if you look, for instance, of life insurance, there has been a great change in the composition of the investments of the households in life insurance in favor of more risky and higher return, of course, higher return products. And hopefully this will continue in the years to come.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Talia. So Talia, I understand that AFME has published a report, so maybe you can elaborate on what are the main findings of this report and what are your conclusions.
Well, thank you, and it is a great pleasure to be with all of you today. So indeed, AFME has recently published a report summarizing the latest status of 8 key performance indicators on a number of metrics like access to market finance, the levels of bank lending, transition to a sustainable finance, digital economy, etc. And I thought I would kind of mention 5 key findings that I thought it would be relevant to highlight. So the first one is that European capital markets has been resilient during this COVID period. Indeed, we all have seen the unprecedented support that came from the government and central banks that resulted in stable market conditions. We've also seen substantial bank lending and increased kind of financing activities that meant that a number of corporations have been quite supported during this period. Now, if you look a little bit closer, we found that it's really kind of the large, more highly rated companies that have benefited from access to capital markets. And the picture has been a bit more mixed when you're looking at other type of companies. Just to give you a stat, to put it in perspective, if we look at the first half of 2020, less than 1% of the debt issuance for the French and German companies was in these smaller companies, which meant that the reliance on bank lending continues to be quite elevated. So in the beginning of the pandemic, we see increased issuance, especially on the investment grade space. And in 2021, we've seen a bit of rotation into the high yield markets and the equity financing as well. They were more prominent, especially as we've seen the normalization of credit spreads over this period. Spreads have tightened more than 500 basis points. So if we look at the composition, we've seen that high yield issuance increased by 68% year on year in the first half of 2021. Equity increased as well. So now that almost 3.4% of the non-financial companies financing is coming in this space. And again, to put it in perspective, that used to be between 0.5 to 2% from a historical perspective since 2002. IPOs, and it was mentioned before, issuances increased 430% on a year-on-year basis. And also the follow-on issuances that come after that expanded as well by almost 60%. So when you see it across the board, there are quite elevated growth rates in terms of the usage of alternative financing channels on a proportionate basis. But if you look at the absolute levels, continue to be relatively small, especially as when we compare it with the US markets. And again, only 17% of European corporates fund themselves in capital markets. In the US, the equivalent number is more than 40%. US issuance in capital markets was 2 times larger than Europeans on the first half in 2021. So even though we have seen a definitely kind of an increase into alternative ways of financing in the corporate sector, there's still an equity gap. And it is quite fundamental as we're looking to kind of expand the avenues of financing to be kind of open-minded to continue to support alternative sources of financing, especially as we're moving from an area, the period, the COVID period, what is more like looking at solvency of corporations to now look at supporting sustainable growth for the years to come. So one of the questions that we're being asked in a lot of these panels is whether that change is structural or really was the output of the support from COVID. I think this is an open question that we are all here to kind of see. And the last point that I would make, and I think it was mentioned at the opening statements as well, is the importance of ESG issuance. ESG has expanded quite a lot in Europe. Europe and especially France is the world leaders in the space. The ESG issuance in the first half of 2021 increased by 80%, more than 80%, and really kind of dominated by social bond issuance. We've seen green issuance, we've seen sustainable issuance, etc. So as we're looking to support corporations in their growth plans, as we're looking to support the transition into a sustainable economy, having a broader universe of financing avenues is of key importance.
Thank you very much, Talia, for these thoughtful remarks. I think we'll discuss ESG in more depth in the next panel, but maybe going back to the gap that you have mentioned that still remains to be filled, I would like now to turn to Nicolas. So Nicolas, I think BPI France has tried to make a number of initiatives to facilitate the funding of all kinds of firms, in particular in terms of equity. What is your assessment of these initiatives? Can you share with us your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So indeed, we have deployed in 2021 approximately 3.5 billion euros of equity. So it's a big number. Actually, we are doing today one deal per day, including Saturdays and Sundays. So it benefited, as far as our direct investments are concerned, something like 300 companies in the year. And as far as the funds of funds are concerned, we have financed approximately 50 funds this year and deployed in funds of funds 1.2 billion. The nature of the products, I mean, it's classically equity, of course, straight equity, which is extremely efficient because we intervene in the governance, we're present at the boards, our private fund, which are our partners, are present at the boards, and they can really implement transformation, including in climate change. We also have debt funds, which have been extremely active this year. We have developed new kinds of products, and notably a family of convertible obligations, but with, I would say, small amounts. Typically, usually, when you do a convertible in a company, it's a couple of hundreds of thousands of euros minimum. You do due diligence and so forth. But we wanted to scale that business, and therefore we developed the concept of small tickets of convertibles with tickets which are 20,000, 30,000 euros, 30K. And because we wanted the volumetry to be reached, we have those convertible obligations completely industrialized and distributed by our banking network. So not by the investors of the investment company, but by the banking network of BPI France across our 50 branches on the field. And this was very successful. We did that for the tourism industry in the middle of the crisis, and we did that also for the tech industry, because those convertibles were particularly suited for the bridge financing of tech companies which were blocked by the COVID crisis. In many instances, the fundraising rounds were immediately stopped in March and April 2020. So we invented that product so that they can wait for the restart of the fundraising, which actually happened, 7 to 9 months afterwards. So we tried to be as creative as possible, notwithstanding what we did with the state guaranteed loan, of course, which was a great success, and that we contributed to the distribution and to the orchestration. That was in 2020. Now, the latest innovation, I would say, of BPI France as far as equity financing of companies concerned is the fact that we are co-founders of a SPAC that will be launched at the beginning of 2022. We think it's absolutely essential that Paris be equipped with a significant number of SPAC actors, I would say, because we have in front of us a major challenge, which is the listing of our tech companies. The listing of the French tech is in front of us. We have 25 unicorns. We would like them to be listed on Euronext. We want liquidity for them, and I mean that's a whole chapter which is to be documented first and then orchestrated and implemented.
Thank you very much. I think you have mentioned that you would like to support firms going public. Is there a doctrine? When do you assess that firms should go public? Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yes, of course. In the board of startups, you have many funds. It's very different from the classical private equity scene, in which you have one, maybe two funds. Very often in a startup, you will find 6 to 7 funds. So you have to build a consensus across the table on when we should list the company. Our position is that we should not list too early. There was too many instances, cases of mediocre result of the listing because the listing was done too early in the life of the company. It is painful for the company. It is burdensome, and there is so much money now in the private equity scene and in the venture capital scene that you can wait before you go public. Second, when you go public, you really need now to reconcile the valuation views of the private equity investors and of the public investors. And we have to recognize that this reconciliation is fairly done on the US market because there is a very deep education on tech in the public markets of North America, but it is still to be done, I would say, in Paris, but not only Paris, also on the Deutsche Börse, also in Amsterdam. So we need to be careful to be successful in the listings of those unicorns going forward. And again, it's not only the case for Paris, it's the case for many stock market places in Europe. For that, there is the question of the valuation, of course, and there's the question of the critical mass of cornerstone investors on the public market that will be patient capital holders in these companies, in these listed companies, that they will sustain and support the valuations, and they will accompany those companies during the 2, 3, maybe first years of listing. This is absolutely essential. This is what we do. There are some other actors, but today I would say that considering the mass of capital that is going to be needed for those listings in the next 3 years, we're talking of a lot of money. We need more cornerstone investors, and we have one reference, which is Sweden. Sweden has succeeded in its policy of listing their own Swedish unicorns because they have managed to, generate and orchestrate a family of stable investors, cornerstone Swedish investors. And because the listing is a success, there is no sort of downturn of the stock price after the listing. It attracts the capital coming from the US, from London, and from other countries. So it's extremely a win-win. This is what we need to succeed on in Paris. We don't have a lot of time. We have I would say 18 months to do that. This is why we have pushed some initiatives with ourselves, we will dedicate 600 million euros to the listing of French unicorns in the next 3 years, 200 million euros per year. And we have an initiative that we share with Caisse des dépôts et consignations, but also with other actors in Paris, so that we secure that equipment, again, of cornerstone investors going forward in Paris.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for these remarks. So I take from this that we need a powerful domestic base of investors to be able to build successful capacity to.
We need analysts also. Huh? We need liquidity. We need analysts, and we need stable investors and patient investors.
Thank you. Maybe I will ask Jean-Jacques Morin to come in at this point. Maybe as a first step, maybe you could provide us with your view on how did you face the health crisis? Have the markets brought about adequate support? How do you see this troubled period?
So good afternoon, everybody. Maybe to be able to answer the question, a few elements of how Accor was impacted by this crisis. We basically started to lose 80% of our turnover and basically went back worldwide to a business level that was the one of the 1980s. So we basically went back in time quite significantly. I think it's important to understand the depths of the crisis and hence the answer to the question. On the other side, we were, I would say, either talentuous or lucky. I'll pick up talentuous. Because in fact we just completed the sale of many assets as part of a roadmap that we've got to transform the company into a service company. And so we ended up with a lot of liquidity on the balance sheet. We started with significant liquidity on the balance sheet. So nevertheless, we went into the crisis and where I think the markets were very supportive. They were very supportive in various ways. I mean, first off, it was quite easy to raise significant revolving credit facility to cover for short-term liquidity needs. Second, in fact, we had to go 2 times through covenant rediscussion, and they went, in fact, very smoothly, provided that we enter the crisis with the right business model. We enter the crisis with a very significant, strong balance sheet, and so that probably smoothed some of those discussions. But the reception from anybody who, in fact, we had to talk to was very, very supportive. And last not least, and it was mentioned, the convertible became a very good tool as the stock price was depressed. And so we went through an issuance that was 7 times oversubscribed. So I really cannot complain, being the CFO of Accor, of the support that we got from the people that are, basically intervening on markets. If you look at the other side of the coin, which is the regulators, I think what the AMF did, and it was also done in the US markets, by stating that if you didn't know what your guidance would be, you could stop it, was a blessing. Because in fact, everybody wanted to know what was happening and nobody really knew. And frankly, the story is that nobody knew months after months. Just to give you some facts on that, I mean, we started the year with a consensus at 900 million of EBITDA, and every month we basically lost 100 million. In fact, some months we lost more than 100 million to end up at year-end at minus 400. So just to tell you, it would have been very, very difficult to predict back in March what would be the year-end with that kind of phenomenon and the amplitude of it. So all of that, in fact, was in the end calming what the interaction and the discussion that we're having with all the investors, and I think it was a very smart move. Other consequences from regulation perspective is that all this industry, and I'm talking everybody in the industry, EHG, Hilton, Marriott, anybody, got downgraded by the rating agencies. So I think it was a little bit mechanical. The other mechanical effect is Accor lost its position on the CAC 40 because the market valuation was very depressed with what I told you on the stock market evolution being linked to the revenue being able to be generated. But on the other hand, to just finish on a positive note here, we integrated the CAC 40 of ESG. We talked of greening of the financing. I mean, this was in the introduction of the chairman. You also made some comments on that, and I think that's a big revolution which is on its way. But I understand it's the second panel that will have the pleasure to discuss it.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. I must say, from a financial market supervisor viewpoint, it's quite comforting to hear that market finance has proven to be resilient in the time of the crisis. Maybe to mention another topic, more looking forward, Accor was the first issuer to sponsor the creation of a corporate SPAC in Europe, which was successfully listed in Paris in May. Can you share with us what are the reasons that led you to choose this vehicle and this technique?
Yeah, Accor loves innovation. Is that the answer? Okay, listen.
Good.
I think as part of the strategy of Accor, we don't only sell hotel. We've tried to look at something which is wider that we've been calling augmented hospitality. So what is augmented hospitality? It's basically looking at the adjacencies around your business model and try to basically generate more value. In practical terms, it means that somebody is not only staying in the bed, but somebody is also willing to get food and beverage, somebody is also willing to get entertainment, somebody is also willing to get concierge type of services. And we've been looking at things that are not really at the core of what you would expect an hospitality player to do, but to look at all those things around that. And so the SPAC and the corporate SPAC is one way to execute that strategy. It has two big advantages. First off, it's not my money, so I kind of like it when it's not my balance sheet. And the second one is that it creates an equity story which remains crisp for Accor. One of the things that market don't understand so well is when you try to do things which are too innovative. Right? Market hates that. And so when you do and focus, in fact, the SPAC on adjacencies, so things which are creating value, but not really at the crux of what is your business model, you in fact win on both sides. You win on the perception from the market, and you win also on value creation for the company overall. So that's why we basically went for that corporate SPAC. Now, why Paris? I mean, it's a corporate SPAC, which means that the sponsor is a corporate. The corporate is Accor. Accor is on the Paris finance market. And so it makes a lot of sense that the SPAC to be listed on that market too. I must say again here, and I'm not really in the business of giving compliments, but we got absolutely gorgeous support from anybody around the SPAC. Maybe because it was the first one, but I think through the support from the AMF, through the support from Euronext, we were basically from inception to capital raising, being able to do it in 4 weeks. I think it was something that I would not have bet at the beginning on. So really, really very strong support, the willingness to get a positioning here from the French authorities, French markets that really help us push that thing through. And so from that angle, a good success. I'd say that it's really a different animal than a normal SPAC, because what we bring as a counterpart to that SPAC is the expertise of Accor. We've done a lot of merger and acquisition over the last years. We know the space of those adjacencies very well, and so the counterpart for getting, in fact, monies is the fact that we bring our competences to the table, and we know how to run a company, we know how to acquire a company, we know how to deal with listing, which is not the case of many of the other players, I would say. And so I think that from that perspective, corporate SPAC is a different animal.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Maybe coming back to you, Talia, I think from the remarks made by Nicolas and Jean-Jacques, I would like to mention that there has been quite a lot of support by public entities. BPI France has been quite helpful. But I think Jean-Jacques also, those perspectives that seem to imply that maybe the recent increase is not a purely might be a lasting phenomenon. What's your impression on this? Do you see the trends going forward?
Well, there are a few things to highlight as I'm trying to address your question. So firstly, if you look back, you'll see that the corporate insolvencies that we've seen so far are low. Now, maybe that's not a surprise on the back of the extraordinary support that we've seen and the various kind of government kind of measures that supported the economy. Average NPL, for example, the ratios have been decreasing. It was only 2.3% for the second quarter of 2021. But this situation could change. As the chair of the supervisory board of the ECB recently kind of mentioned, he asked for a cautious optimism in that regard. Second, if you see how the use of cash has been deployed since the beginning of the crisis, is we've seen a lot of volumes, the majority of the volumes in 2020 were used really as a way to kind of shelter corporations from the adverse economic impacts of the crisis. But now, as we look back, as we look forward into 2021 and beyond, a lot of the corporations have been preparing for a more stable environment. But that said, if you look at the small organization, the unlisted companies, the mid-caps, etc., and that it should be almost like the driving force, behind driving economic growth. There's still the reliance to bank lending is too much. So bank loans will not going to be enough to cover this gap, and this is where the development of equity markets is important. The development of hybrid instruments to kind of support future growth can play a very important role. AFME has recently published 2 reports highlighting that alternative instruments in the form of hybrid solutions, which will be tailored to a local tax, accounting, kind of regimes and in every single country, can potentially bridge the gap between where the corporate issuers are and where the kind of the investor base is. France, on that point, actually France is leading the way amongst the member states. Launched recently the government-supported subordinated debt program for SMEs and mid-caps, as recognizing that some sort of public support will be needed. At AFME, we continue to see value in the development of a pan-European recapitalization instrument, that would benefit from the transparency, the liquidity, the scale, and kind of the depth that a single market can offer. That will, attracting a very kind of broad interest from investors. And actually, this is one of the main goals of the Capital Markets Union. So having a broad, deep, liquid, well-functioning capital markets is then quite essential in allowing, from one side, corporations to continue to have access to their financing needs and sustain growth, but also to individuals as they're looking to, manage their savings and kind of pensions money as well. There are a number of measures that AFME, the organization, is supporting that is contributing to increased transparency, the well-functioning of capital markets in Europe. A few examples are along the lines of real-time consolidated tape on the equity side, well-calibrated regimes on the fixed income markets, as well is quite important. It's also important to recognize that the European authorities also have an important role to play in exploring these dynamics and really prioritize the policies that support company listings, improve the overall attractiveness of IPOs, we mentioned that before in the listings, and really kind of restore well-functioning securitization markets, for example, as we do need kind of a plethora of financing kind of avenues to really kind of enhance and kind of support economic growth from now.
Thank you very much, Delia. I think you have mentioned a lot of topics that are currently under discussion at EU level, and that we hope to be able to make progress on all these topics, taking advantage of the fact that France will be president of the European Union, will chair the Council, sorry. But focusing back on the Paris Financial Center, maybe Nicolas, you have mentioned in your previous remarks some of the key components of having an attractive stock market. More broadly, how do you see the competitiveness of Paris as a financial center? What are its strengths, its weaknesses? Where should we focus to make progress?
I think that progressively in the past 15 years we have built an incredible ecosystem of venture capital funds and private equity funds. Maybe people don't know that the venture capital funds of France have approximately 40% of market share in Europe, which means that in 40% of the deals you will find the fingerprints of those funds. So that's a tremendous success, that's an infrastructure, that's an asset. And honestly, when you have a good project in France, with all those seed funds, Series A, B, growth, and so forth, with the latest growth initiative, you cannot say that you're not going to find equity. We even have now, I think, a good set of funds which are capable to put significant tickets of 50, 60, 70 million euros, sometimes 100 million euros. BPI France, we made the decision this week to invest 100 million euros in a round for one French startup. So all this was dreamed of and has happened. Now the question is the exit of the French tech. And it would be terrible if the exit would only be possible on the Nasdaq. I say it absolutely bluntly. And for that not to happen, we need to mobilize. I mean, it's a little bit of a call to arms. We need investors, we need deep pockets, we need cornerstones, we need analysts. Again, I just repeat what I said before. And we don't have a lot of time. But we can make it. It's just a question of articulation, coordination, consensus, and determination. So the assets which are going to be listed are very good assets. Very good assets. So how can we do that? First of all, we will play a big role, us BPI France, not only by investing 600 million euros in direct investments in those listed companies, but also through our funds of funds. We will encourage the private equity venture capital funds to be crossover funds, meaning that they will invest in private situations, but also in public situations. Same funds with investment professionals, which will be, I would say, bilingual. They have to know the culture of the private equity, and they have also to know the culture of the equity capital markets. This is what we have in our one of our funds is called large venture funds. It's a 1 billion fund, and the teams are coming from the two horizons. They are bilingual, and they accompany the company to the stock market, and then we stay. This is what we need to implement. And I think that if we could have in Paris, let's say, 6 crossover funds, sizable crossover funds, which are determined to stay at the capital of the companies that they have listed on Euronext, it'll be a good start. And we're ready to invest through our funds of funds significant capital in those funds to induce them, to incite them to go to that new asset class, because it's a new asset class. I think it's going to come faster from that horizon, the horizon of the private equity, than from the classical asset management world, which will take a little bit more time to be tech savvy, I would say. But at the end of the day, and I conclude, we need to create in Paris a listed tech asset vertical, asset class in the asset management business. And to be honest, today we don't really have it. And that the consequence is that when you're a startup leader, you've built your startup in the past 6 years, you've done it all, and you do your first roadshow in Paris. Very often you are confronted to investors who are asking you about dividends, about positive EBITDA, all questions which are, orthogonal to the world of the tech startup, and that would never be asked when you do your roadshow in New York or Boston. So there is a question of cultural transformation, I would say, which is necessary. I'm sorry to be as cash as possible, but that's the virtue of the Entretiens de AMF, I suppose.
Thank you very much for your candidness. Indeed, I think it's very appreciated. Turning now to Jean-Jacques, maybe how would you react to what has been said? Accor is listed on the regulated market. How do you see the attractiveness of this market? Which elements of attractiveness, which regulatory requirements would be the most important to you as an issuer in this market?
Yeah, there are obviously many advantages as being on a regulated market that you know all as well as I do. I mean, the liquidity, the transparency, the fact that there are rules, the fact that you can be on indexes, the fact that you can have a transparent dialogue with investors and various parties. So all of that are the advantages of being on those regulated markets. The one point I would like to make on regulation, it's not so much the regulation as it exists today, but it's more what's coming up in front of us. And again, I'm back to the introduction on the green financing. We just went 10 days ago through an SLB at Accor. So we raised a couple hundred millions through an SLB. And the question that we've got is all what needs to be disclosed, which is very much unclear. And I'll use an analysis that I read from Bain or BCG, one of those firms, which looked at more than 1,000 companies on the quality of the carbon disclosure that are made along the line of those financing, because we did, it was a carbon-related financing that we did. And they basically say that the numbers are right with a 30% error probability. So 30%, it's quite a big number. And it's a good example in my view, because I'm not saying that I'm much better than any of the firm in that sample on the kind of challenges that we'll have. So I know it's addressed. I think you introduced it with the 2-year lag between the various task force which are working on that and what will come in effect. But that could be a significant burden, or it is already a significant burden on companies. And all that, what I call extra financial reporting, is something where we look at it, we know it's coming, we know it may be Kilimanjaro, but we don't really know which side of the Kilimanjaro we will climb, so we are waiting. So any guidance is welcome. That's what I would say. I'm trying to be as cash as Mr. Dufourcq, but he's obviously much stronger than I am.
Well, you are indeed. I can confirm this. This issue will be elaborated in more depth in the following panel, I think, over issues regarding ESG. So it remains for me to thank you all for your participation in this panel.